This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I usually rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition, but sometimes I like to rank cards based on some other criteria, and today we're going to take a look at the 10 most expensive Planeswalkers in Magic, and for each of them I'll explain what exactly makes them so expensive. A few things to keep in mind. First, I'm only using the original printing of cards, so that means no foils or promos or anything like that. Second, the prices used in this video are Card Kingdom near mint prices, and it's possible that the prices have changed. If you want to own any of these Planeswalkers, you can of course find them in the Card Kingdom store, and you can find direct links for each of them in the description. Before we jump into the video, I also want to say that if you've been enjoying my content and haven't subscribed yet, consider hitting that subscribe button. I would really appreciate it. Alright, let's take a look at the 10 most expensive Planeswalkers in Magic. At number 10, it's Tezzeret the Seeker, who costs about $20. For 3 generic and 2 blue, this 4 loyalty Planeswalker comes with 3 abilities that really love artifacts. His +1 lets you untap 2 artifacts, his -X lets you tutor up an artifact with mana value X or less and put it directly on the battlefield, and the -5 turns all of your artifacts into 5/5 creatures until end of turn. The +1 can be used to untap mana rocks for a huge mana advantage, and being able to tutor up artifacts directly to the battlefield is really powerful. Between 2008 and 2019, Tezzeret the Seeker was the centerpiece in artifact control decks across multiple 60-card formats. This deck, often called Tezzerator, was loaded up with prison artifacts that he could tutor up to lock down the game, and he could even eventually win the game by animating all of them. Right now, he's not seeing play in any 60-card formats, but he has caught on in a big way in Commander. If you're playing an artifact deck of any kind, you should probably be playing Tezzeret, and even if you aren't in an artifact deck, he's worth considering, especially because many Commander decks have plenty of mana rocks to untap and other artifacts to tutor up. At number 9, it's the Wandering Emperor, who costs about $21. For 2 generic and 2 white, she's a 3 loyalty Planeswalker with Flash, and as long as she's entered the battlefield this turn, her loyalty abilities can be activated anytime you could cast an instant, and all 3 of her abilities get a big upgrade when you can use them at instant speed. Her +1 puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature and gives it first strike until end of turn, her -1 makes a 2/2 Samurai with Vigilance, and her -2 lets you exile a tapped creature and you gain 2 life. The fact she has Flash makes her a very attractive Planeswalker for control decks, since they can leave their mana up to use removal or counter magic if they need it, and then still add a very scary Planeswalker to the board if their other cards aren't needed, but she's also quite good in aggro decks since she can buff your creatures and help you go wide. This has put the Emperor in really high demand in many formats, including Standard, Pioneer, Modern, and Legacy. She doesn't see a ton of play in EDH, but her demand in 60-card formats is about as high as it can be, especially because she's also still legal in Standard. She probably should see more play in Commander too, since she fits great in pretty much any white deck, but can be especially good in decks that are interested in +1/+1 counters or creature tokens. At number 8, it is Sarkhan Unbroken, who costs about $22. For 2 generic, a green, a blue, and a red, Sarkhan is a 4 loyalty Planeswalker with a +1 that lets you draw a card and add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, a -2 that puts a 4/4 Flying Dragon token into play, and a -8 that lets you search your library for any number of dragons and put them directly on the battlefield. Sarkhan has never seen much play in Magic's 60-card formats with only a single second-tier top 8, and while he is a factor in EDH, he certainly doesn't see heavy play there either. He's in a little over 13,000 decks on EDH Rec, so what's the deal here? Why is he one of the most expensive Planeswalkers right now? Well, I think there are 2 main factors. The first is that dragons are really popular. Any card that does something powerful and cool with dragons tends to cost more than would normally make sense, simply because many players are interested in building dragon decks, including on the kitchen table. The second factor is scarcity. Of all the Planeswalkers on the list, it's been the longest since Sarkhan Unbroken has received a printing, and that's because he's never been reprinted since showing up in 2015's Dragons of Tarkir, so while the demand isn't enormous, it is enough to put a strain on the supply of Sarkhan Unbrokens out there. At number 7, it is Liliana Dreadhorde General, who costs about $23. For 4 generic and 2 black, she is a 6 loyalty Planeswalker that is well worth that hefty investment. Her static ability draws you a card anytime one of your creatures dies, making any trade you make into a 2-for-1, and making any chump block you do much less of a chump block. Her +1 gives you a zombie to protect her, and the great thing is that her static ability doesn't say non-token, so those zombies dying to protect her will give you cards. Her -4 is a symmetrical double edict effect. While it is technically symmetrical, the fact is that you get back 2 cards if you sacrifice your 2 creatures and your opponent doesn't, so she has a built-in way to break that symmetry. Then if you get to her ultimate, she makes your opponent lose most of their board. Like most 6-mana Planeswalkers, when it comes to 60-card formats, Liliana sees play in control decks. Right now she's seeing a bit of play in Pioneer, but she's far from a fixture in the format. Instead, Commander plays the biggest factor in driving up demand for Liliana. She's in over 65,000 decks in EDH Rec. She should be played in virtually any Black Commander deck, as her slew of abilities make her something your opponents really have to deal with. She's even better in multiplayer, as her -4 and -9 both affect all players. She can be particularly busted in sacrifice decks, where her static ability can turn into a crazy engine. Like Sarkhan Unbroken, part of the reason for her high price is also scarcity. So far, Liliana has only appeared in 2019's War of the Spark, and while that's relatively recent, the demand for the card is high enough that the card is in short supply. At number 6, it's Karn, the Great Creator, which costs about $24. This is our second consecutive War of the Spark Planeswalker. For 4 generic mana, Karn's a 5 loyalty Planeswalker who shuts off the activated abilities of all artifacts your opponents control. He's got a +1 that animates an artifact you control until your next turn, making it into a creature with power and toughness each equal to the mana value of the card, and he has a -2 that lets you grab an artifact from your sideboard and put it into your hand. Karn started to see play in multiple 60-card formats the moment he was printed, and decks tend to get the most value out of his ability to tutor up an artifact from your sideboard. He wasn't played in Standard at all because there wasn't anything crazy you could do with him there, but he's caught on in all the other formats. In Pioneer, he's played in Devotion to Green decks, where he can be used to grab powerful artifacts out of your sideboard that you can spend all your mana on, like Cityscape Leveler. In Modern, he's been played in a variety of decks, with Tron and Urza decks being the most frequent home. In those decks, Karn was used as a win condition. He could be used to search up Mycosynth Lattice from the sideboard, and that plus his static ability means your opponent's lands now can't do anything, since they're artifacts. If that isn't enough to make your opponent scoop, you can also use Karn's +1 to blow up a land every turn once the Lattice is in play. This combo eventually led to the Lattice being banned in Modern. Before that ban, Karn was a prison card and win condition all in one in the format. He's also been utilized in Legacy, Painter's Servant, Grindstone decks, where he can help you set up your combo a lot more easily. Vintage is arguably where Karn is at his most powerful though, as he shuts off all the mana rocks of the Power 9, and he can wish for the Time Vault Voltaic Key combo. This all made artifact decks too good in the format, so much so that he got restricted in Vintage in 2019. In short, the demand for Karn in 60-card formats is through the roof. You can expect to see him across the table from you in pretty much any paper format. He's less impressive in EDH though, because his -2 effectively does nothing there. While the 40,000 plus decks he sees play in over on EDH Rec seems impressive, Karn can be played in literally any commander deck because he's colorless, and that means he's in less than 1% of all the decks on EDH Rec. However, he isn't entirely useless in the format either. Artifacts are commonplace, especially mana rocks, so Karn's ability to turn those off has some serious value, and if you're playing an artifact-focused commander, the +1 can do some surprising work too. It's also worth noting that, like Liliana Dreadhorde General, Karn the Great Creator also hasn't received a reprint since its original printing in War of the Spark. At number 5, it's Daretti, Ingenious Iconoclast. This 3-loyalty Planeswalker costs 1 generic, a black, and a red. He has a +1 that creates a 1/1 construct with Defender. He has a -1 that lets you sacrifice an artifact, and if you do, you destroy an artifact or a creature. And he has a -6 ultimate that lets you create 3 token copies of any artifact in a graveyard or on the battlefield. So, obviously enough, this goblin loves artifacts. His +1 can protect him and synergize as well with the -1, and his -6 is powerful enough to break the game wide open in many situations. It's especially nice that he doesn't demand the artifact be in play, and it doesn't have to even be on your side of the battlefield or in your graveyard either, so you're often going to have a target for that -6 without even trying very hard. Because he was printed in Conspiracy Take the Crown, Daretti was never legal in Standard and isn't legal in Pioneer or Modern, so it's only limited to the Eternal formats, and it has seen some sporadic play there, obviously in Artifact decks. He also isn't very heavily played in Commander, appearing in around 6,000 decks on EDH Rec. I do think he's being underplayed though, as he should seriously be considered by anyone who's playing an Artifact deck that meets the color requirements to play him. This is another case where scarcity is probably the biggest factor. It's a mythic rare that has only been printed a single time, and it isn't from a standard release set, so there aren't nearly as many Darettis out there in the environment as there are of mythic rares from a typical set. At number 4, it is Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, who costs about $26. For 3 generic, a white, and a blue, Teferi is a 4 loyalty planeswalker. His +1 draws you a card and then untaps up to 2 lands at the beginning of the next instep. His -3 lets you put a non-land permanent into its owner's library third from the top, and the ultimate is a -8 that gives you an emblem that exiles target permanent an opponent controls anytime you draw a card. Teferi is a control player's dream. His +1 gets you deeper in your deck, while making sure you have lands untapped to interact with your opponent on the next turn. His -3 is a nice removal spell, and his ultimate is a very real win condition. Teferi has appeared in top 8 decks in Standard, Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and he's simply one of the best planeswalkers ever printed, and that has led to it being in really high demand in all the 60-card formats he's legal in. Like Karn the Great Creator, there's a good chance you're going to play with or against Teferi in multiple formats right now. He's also reasonably popular in Commander, though he's not quite as game-warping there. He's very good at taking over the game against a single opponent, but when you have multiple opponents, none of his abilities are nearly as impressive. Having 2 mana untapped isn't going to do enough for you to interact on all opponents' turns, and his ultimate is a lot slower when there are so many permanents to deal with. Still, he's playing over 20,000 decks on EDHREC. At number 3, it's Jace the Mind Sculptor, which costs about $33. Probably the game's most iconic Planeswalker card, Jace the Mind Sculptor is also certainly on the shortlist for best Planeswalker of all time. For 2 generic and 2 blue, Jace is a 3 loyalty Planeswalker, and he comes with 4 abilities, something that had never happened back when he was printed in Worldwake. His +2 lets you look at the top card of a player's library, and you can choose to put that card on the bottom of that library. He has a 0 that effectively casts Brainstorm. In other words, you draw 3 and then put 2 cards back on top of your library. He has a -1 that bounces a creature, and an ultimate that's a -12 that exiles all cards from a player's library, and then they shuffle their hand into their library. These abilities are all great, but if you've never played with Jace before, I think you'd be surprised by just how powerful that +2 is. It gives you a ton of control over what your opponent is going to draw, while making Jace harder to kill at the same time, and that combination does a great job of allowing Jace to stick around and warp the game around him. He's been a fixture in 60-card formats ever since being printed. He was so format warping in Standard that he got banned there, and when the Modern format was created in 2011, he was preemptively banned in that format too, though he did get unbanned in 2018. Right now, he's seeing a ton of play in Modern control decks, and Legacy and Vintage are certainly formats where he's continuing to be an important card in the format. So this is another Planeswalker that you're likely to see in every 60-card format he's legal in. Kind of like Teferi, he's not quite as nuts in multiplayer games, so he isn't a staple in Commander, though he does see a reasonable amount of play in the format. One interesting thing about Jace is that unlike a lot of walkers on this list, he's been reprinted, and not just once either. He got reprints in Eternal Masters, Masters 25, and Double Masters, so there is a decent supply of Jaces out there in the marketplace, but the demand is still really high. I also think the card's notoriety helps elevate its price even higher, as it's widely thought of as one of the best cards ever printed, meaning a wider swath of players are interested in getting their hands on it than would otherwise be the case. At number 2, it is Ugin, the Spirit Dragon, which costs about $38. He costs 8 mana and starts with 7 loyalty. His +2 does 3 to any target. His -X exiles each permanent that's 1 or more colors with a mana value of X or less. His ultimate is a -10 that gains you 7 life, draws you 7 cards, and lets you put 7 permanents from your hand onto the battlefield. Ugin is arguably the most powerful Planeswalker ever printed, at least in a vacuum. By that I mean, when he's in play, he is more game warping than any other Planeswalker. But the problem is Ugin costs 8 mana, and that makes him less impressive overall than some of the lower value Planeswalkers out there. His -6 is particularly powerful. He starts with such high loyalty that Ugin can very frequently come down and wipe the board of everything but himself, at which point he can just take over the game with that +2. In 60-card formats, Ugin has appeared in ramp decks in Standard, Pioneer, and Modern. He's simply one of the best things you can ramp into in this entire game. Ugin is also heavily played in Commander. Unlike some of the other walkers we've seen, Ugin is great against multiple opponents, as that -X affects everyone, making it very easy for Ugin to take over a game, even when you have a bunch of opponents. He benefits from being colorless too, meaning literally any Commander deck can play him if they want to. However, there is one Planeswalker that's more expensive, and that's of course our number 1 card, which is Wrenn and Six, which costs about $43. It's sort of funny that the number 1 card on this list is tied for the lowest mana value Planeswalker ever, while the number 2 card, Ugin, is tied for the highest mana value Planeswalker ever. For a red and a green, Wrenn and Six is a 3 loyalty Planeswalker with a +1 that lets you return a land from your graveyard to your hand, a -1 that pings something, and a -7 that gives you an emblem that gives all of your instants and sorceries retrace. That means you can cast them from your graveyard if you discard a land from your hand in addition to paying their cost. Wrenn and Six was printed in Modern Horizons, which means the only 60-card formats it's been legal in are Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and while that certainly limits the card's opportunities, it has done a ton with those opportunities. The +1 and -1 are where it generates most of its value. The -1 can pick off a whole lot of small creatures in those formats, like Delver of Secrets or Ragavan, and the +1 can become an absolutely insane engine, especially in formats with lands that sacrifice themselves for value. This has been abused to the greatest effect in Legacy and Vintage alongside Strip Mine and Wasteland, where Wrenn and Six allows you to destroy an opposing land every single turn, and that does a pretty good job of allowing you to take over a game. Wrenn and Six worked the entire Legacy format around itself. The -1 made it very hard to play X1s in the format at all, and recurring Wasteland every single turn was simply too good. So in the end, Wrenn and Six found itself banned in Legacy. That means today, Wrenn and Six is only legal in Modern and Vintage when it comes to 60-card formats, but it is being played quite heavily in both. For a card only legal in a limited number of 60-card formats, the demand for Wrenn and Six is really high, and that coupled with general scarcity is the main reason for its elevated price tag. Wrenn and Six doesn't see a ton of play in Commander, as we're talking about another Planeswalker who doesn't stack up nearly as well in multiplayer games. So, those are the 10 most expensive Planeswalkers in Magic. If you're interested in getting your hands on any of these powerhouses, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to stay aware of future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at Planeswalkers as well as the most expensive cards in the game, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron, and you can find ways to do both of those things in the description. Thanks for watching.